Join me as I challenge myself to visit the scariest gas stations out there that are sure to give me nightmares. You know, gas stations are a staple of modern life, places we visit every day to fuel up and grab a quick snack. But beneath their bright lights and bustling activities, some gas stations hold dark secrets. A few of them are downright terrifying. When the sun goes down and the streets grow quiet, the isolation of a 24-hour gas station can be overwhelming. You're alone, miles from civilization, and vulnerable to the worst of humanity. The possibility of crime lurks in every shadow, and the sounds of the night can play tricks on your mind. It's a perfect storm of fear that can leave even the bravest of souls paralyzed with dread. And then there are the unsettling encounters, the strange characters that lurk in the corners, the unexplained noises, and the eerie feelings that you can't shake. These are the things that nightmares are made of. Add to that the looming presence of surveillance cameras, always watching, always recording, and you're left feeling like an animal trapped in a cage. The gas station becomes a prison, confining you in a world of fear and uncertainty. And what about the attendants? Are they friend or foe? Do they know more than they're letting on, or are they just as trapped as you are? The questions swirl in your mind like a nightmare from which you can't awaken. Imagine walking into a dingy gas station in the dead of night, the air thick with the stench of stale cigarettes and desperation. The fluorescent lights overhead flicker like fireflies, casting an eerie glow over the entire scene. You try to shake off the feeling of unease, telling yourself it's just your imagination. But deep down, you know better. This is a place where the line between reality and nightmare is blurred, and you're not sure which side you're on. Many gas stations have earned a reputation for being hotbeds of paranormal activity, from ghostly apparitions to unexplained occurrences. These places have left a trail of terror in their wake. Take the old Highway 666 gas station in New Mexico, for instance. This place has witnessed its fair share of gruesome murders and untimely deaths, leaving behind a legacy of terror that still haunts it to this day. Or the notorious gas station on Route 66, where strange noises and ghostly apparitions have been reported by more than a few brave souls who dared to venture in after dark. But among all these, there's one gas station that stands out as the most disturbing, the Kimi_ gas station in South Korea. This place is notorious for its dark history of murders, kidnappings, and even human trafficking. The building itself seems to exude an aura of malevolence, as if the walls have absorbed the evil that has taken place within them. It's a place where the fabric of reality seems to be torn apart, leaving you staring into the abyss. As I wrap up this journey into the heart of terror, left with a sense of dread that I can't shake. The bright lights and bustling activity of gas stations will never be the same for me. Always be looking over my shoulder, wondering what horrors lurk in the shadows, waiting to pounce. And I know I'm not alone. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the scariest gas stations out there. If you've got a scary gas station story of your own, be sure to share it in the comments below. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for more horror-themed content that'll keep you up all night.
Part 1, The Wrong Turn. It was 1:30 a.m. when my gas light flickered on. I cursed myself for not filling up sooner, but I was deep in the countryside, miles from any semblance of civilization. The road stretched out like a ribbon of black ink in front of me, only interrupted by the occasional glowing eyes of nocturnal creatures darting into the trees. The first sign for gas appeared after what felt like an eternity. Kimi_gas station, 2 miles. I hadn't seen another sign of life for over 30 minutes, and part of me hesitated at the idea of stopping in a place like this at such an hour. But the reality of running out of fuel in the middle of nowhere forced my hand. As I neared the gas station, I felt a strange sense of dislocation. It was like driving into a forgotten place, untouched by time. The building was weathered, with faded signs barely clinging to the sides. The fluorescent lights above the pumps flickered erratically, casting an eerie glow over the forecourt. I pulled up to one of the pumps. The place looked deserted, but the gas station sign still blinked, open 24 hours, in pale neon light. The silence was palpable, a sharp contrast to the hum of the engine. Stepping out of my car, I felt a cool breeze cut through the warm night air. The faint smell of gasoline mixed with something else, something metallic. I pushed the thought aside as my tired mind playing tricks on me. The pump was old, the kind you don't see anymore, with an analog dial and a cracked handle. As I fumbled to unscrew the gas cap, I noticed the surveillance cameras positioned high on the roof. They were ancient, covered in a thin layer of dust, and pointed awkwardly towards the ground. I knew there was no way they were recording anything, but the thought of them made me feel like I was being watched. Halfway through filling the tank, the silence was broken by a soft scraping sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but as it grew louder, I realized it was coming from the far side of the building. A metallic scraping, like a shovel being dragged along the asphalt. I froze, hand tightening on the pump handle as I strained to hear. The noise stopped as abruptly as it had started. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was nothing, just my mind acting up in the isolation of the night. I glanced towards the station's windows, hoping to see the clerk inside, but the inside was completely dark. No one was there. Something felt off. The station, the eerie quiet, the cameras pointed in all the wrong directions, it all seemed like a stage set up for something much worse than just filling your car with gas. I decided to head inside to pay, hoping to brush off the uneasy feeling clawing at the edges of my sanity. As I approached the door, the flickering light above buzzed louder than ever, like an insect caught in a trap. The door creaked open as I pulled it, revealing a small, cramped space that smelled faintly of cigarettes and something sour. Behind the counter was an old CRT television, static flickering on the screen. No one was at the register. I rang the small bell on the counter. The sound seemed to echo unnaturally, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound normal. There was no response, just the steady hiss of static from the television. My fingers drummed nervously on the counter, the sound a frantic contrast to the dead air around me. That's when I noticed something on the television screen. Through the static, a shape began to form, a figure standing in the middle of the forecourt, right next to my car. I stared at the screen, trying to make out details, but the static obscured everything except the vague outline. It wasn't moving, just standing there, waiting. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but through the window, the lot outside was empty. The cameras had to be wrong. But my heart pounded against my ribs as I glanced back at the screen. The figure was still there, now closer to the gas station. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I had to get out of here. Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled softly, as if someone had just entered. #### Part 2, a visitor in the night. The sound of the bell sent a cold rush through my veins. I spun around, fully expecting to see someone, anyone, standing behind me. But the doorway was empty, the darkness outside yawning like a chasm. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, my eyes darting between the open door and the static on the screen. The figure was gone now, swallowed by the snowstorm of pixels. For a moment, I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that my mind was playing tricks on me after the long drive. And then, I heard it again. That scraping sound. It was coming from inside the gas station now. I whirled around to face the aisles, my heart hammering in my chest. The faint overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows over the narrow rows of snacks and drinks. For the first time, I realized just how cramped the place was, how every shelf seemed to loom too high, too close. I moved cautiously, each step echoing louder than the last. My footfalls were accompanied by the soft scrape of metal on tile, as if something, or someone, was dragging something heavy across the floor. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. A quick glance at the back of the store revealed a door, partially ajar, leading into what I assumed was a storage room. The light flickered beyond the gap, and I could just make out the shadow of something moving inside. That's when I noticed it, the faint outline of a hand, curled around the edge of the doorframe. It was pale, almost translucent, with long, gnarled fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly far, scratching slowly at the wood. I felt a scream rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down, taking a step back towards the counter. My body was screaming at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my legs refused to cooperate. It was as if the very air around me had thickened, trapping me in place. The door to the storage room creaked open wider, and for the first time, I saw it. The figure from the television. It was no illusion. No trick of the light. This thing was real. It stood hunched over, its back almost touching the low ceiling. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over bones that jutted out at impossible angles. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning holes into my skin. In its hand, it clutched a large, rusted object, a shovel. The very same one I'd heard scraping earlier. The figure let out a slow, ragged breath, the sound of it sending icy shivers down my spine. I stumbled backward, knocking over a display of candy bars. The noise seemed to jolt me back to life, and I scrambled toward the door, desperate to escape. But as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire building. "Please," I whispered, backing up against the counter, my hands shaking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. Because I already knew. The air grew thick with the smell of rust and decay, and suddenly, the lights overhead flickered out completely. I was plunged into darkness, save for the glow of the static from the old television. I could hear it now, the scraping again, louder, closer. And beneath it, the faint sound of breathing, shallow and uneven, as if it came from right next to me. I reached blindly for my phone, my fingers fumbling to unlock the screen. I needed light. I needed to see what was happening around me. But when the screen finally illuminated, I wished I hadn't turned it on. The figure was standing less than a foot away, towering over me, its face finally visible in the dim glow. It wasn't human. Its eyes were hollow, empty pits of darkness, and its mouth, if you could even call it that, was a jagged tear that split its face from ear to ear. It wasn't smiling, but the sight of it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if it had already decided my fate. My phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing against my cheek with an icy touch that made my skin crawl. And then, it spoke. Not with words, but with the sound of the bell above the door, ringing once again. I blinked, and suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The gas station was empty. The figure was gone. But the door, now wide open, beckoned me to leave. My car was still parked at the pump, the nozzle hanging from the side, forgotten in my panic. Without a second thought, I bolted for the car, my pulse racing as I slammed the door shut and jammed the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back at the gas station one last time. Through the window, I saw the figure standing behind the counter, watching me. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and as I sped away, I could swear I heard the soft chime of the doorbell ringing in the distance. Part 3, The Chase. The darkness swallowed the road as I sped away from Kumi_gas, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. The trees lining the road blurred together into an indistinct mass, and every shadow seemed to twist, morphing into grotesque shapes that reached out for the car. I kept my foot slammed on the gas, heart pounding as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The station was gone, swallowed by the night. But that didn't mean I was safe. I couldn't shake the image of the figure's hollow eyes, the cold touch of its fingers lingering on my cheek. It hadn't followed me, or at least, I hadn't seen it leave. But there was something in the air, a palpable weight pressing down on me, a feeling like I was still being watched. The road stretched out endlessly before me, and I began to wonder if I was even going the right way. Everything looked the same, no landmarks, no familiar signs, just a black ribbon of asphalt winding through an oppressive forest. A part of me considered pulling over, calling someone, anyone, for help. But I didn't dare stop. Not yet. As I rounded a sharp bend, my headlights caught something standing at the edge of the road. I barely had time to register what it was, a tall, dark figure before it disappeared back into the trees, melting into the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively pressed harder on the gas. It couldn't have been real. It couldn't be following me. Could it? The night grew thicker, and soon the only sounds were the hum of the engine and my own ragged breathing. But then, over the noise of the tires on the asphalt, I began to hear it. A distant scraping. My eyes darted to the mirrors again, and for a moment, I swore I saw something moving in the darkness behind me. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a metallic dragging noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My skin crawled, and my mind raced with visions of that shovel, rusted and stained, being pulled closer, inch by inch. I swallowed hard, trying to focus on the road, but the sound wouldn't leave me. I turned the radio on, desperate to drown it out with anything, static, music, anything, but the moment the speakers crackled to life, the radio burst with shrill static. The same image from the gas station's TV flashed in my mind, and I slammed the radio off, feeling a surge of nausea rise in my throat. The scraping was inside my head now, reverberating through my skull. I don't know how long I kept driving like that, the sound echoing in my ears, my thoughts unraveling. The road seemed to stretch on forever, winding endlessly through the night with no signs, no gas stations, no exits. Just me, the dark, and that thing. Then, the headlights flickered. No, 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 I whispered, my voice hoarse. The dashboard lights dimmed momentarily, then surged back to life. But that brief flicker of darkness sent a wave of cold terror rushing through me. The car hadn't stuttered, and the engine purred normally, but the flicker felt like a warning. A reminder. I wasn't alone. The scraping grew louder. Closer. And now I could hear something else beneath it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, matching the rhythm of my racing pulse. My phone buzzed suddenly from the passenger seat, making me jump. I snatched it up, fumbling with it. Maybe it was a message, a notification, anything to break the grip of fear that had wrapped around my throat. It wasn't a message. It was a video call. The number was unknown, just a string of symbols that made no sense, as if the very device had been corrupted by something beyond my understanding. My breath caught in my throat, and for a long moment, I stared at the screen, too terrified to answer, too terrified to decline. It rang again. Against my better judgment, I swiped to accept the call. The screen remained black for a heartbeat, then two, and just as I was about to hang up, the image snapped into focus. It was the gas station. But not just any part of the gas station, the view was from the surveillance cameras, now functioning perfectly. I could see the entire forecourt bathed in dim light, the pump sitting abandoned, the lot empty except for one thing. My car. It was still parked there. My breath caught in my chest. I blinked, staring at the screen. It didn't make sense. I was driving. I had left that place behind. But the car on the screen, the make, the color, even the license plate, was unmistakably mine. And then, in the background, just at the edge of the camera's view, I saw the figure again. Standing motionless at the far side of the gas station, it watched from the shadows. My heart raced as I saw it take one slow, deliberate step forward, the rusty shovel still clutched in its bony hand. The screen flickered, and the view zoomed in. Now, I could see into the car. The driver's seat was empty. With trembling hands, I dropped the phone. It hit the floor of the car with a dull thud, and I slammed my foot down on the gas, the car lurching forward with a roar. My pulse thundered in my ears as the road blurred around me, the trees whipping by in a frenzy of dark shapes. But no matter how fast I drove, that feeling of being chased, of being hunted, clung to me. Then, without warning, my headlights blinked out completely. I screamed, wrenching the steering wheel to the side as the world around me plunged into absolute darkness. The car swerved violently, tires screeching against the pavement as I fought for control. For a few terrifying seconds, I felt the car teeter on the edge of the road, the wheels barely gripping the asphalt. And then, blinding light. The headlights snapped back on, flooding the road ahead. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. My heart pounded as I took in my surroundings. I was no longer on the highway. I was parked right in front of the gas station. The sign flickered weakly in the night, and the same fluorescent lights blinked over the empty pumps. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly I thought I might break it. This wasn't possible. I had driven miles away. The scraping sound returned, louder than ever. And then, from the shadows near the pump, I saw it. The figure stepped forward, shovel in hand, hollow eyes locking onto mine. This time, it was coming for me. Hashtag Part 4, A Cold Descent. The figure advanced with slow, deliberate steps, dragging that cursed shovel across the asphalt. The screech of metal against the ground cut through the air, growing louder, closer, until it filled my ears, an unbearable sound that made my skin crawl. I was paralyzed. My hands were glued to the steering wheel, my breath caught in my throat. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to move, to drive away, but my body refused to obey. It felt like I was sinking into quicksand, the world warping around me as the figure grew nearer. Its hollow eyes seemed to pierce through the windshield, locking onto me with a gaze that held an unnatural weight. The thing looked impossibly tall now, its grotesque, elongated limbs twisting as it walked. The sickly gray skin stretched over its bones glistened under the dim light of the gas station, and the jagged slash of its mouth seemed to twitch, as though it were about to speak. But it didn't need words. The air around me grew thick, suffocating, and the scraping sound drilled into my mind, drowning out everything else. My head throbbed, a sharp pain spreading from behind my eyes as the figure reached the car, its shovel raised. The blade was chipped and rusted, but it looked sharp enough to do damage. Without thinking, I jammed the car into reverse, slamming my foot down on the pedal. The tires screeched, and the car lurched backward, barely avoiding the figure's outstretched hand as it swiped at the air where I'd just been. I twisted the wheel, sending the car careening backward in a wide arc. The road was a blur of shadows and flickering lights, and I wasn't sure where I was going, only that I had to get away. My mind raced as I glanced toward the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure still standing by the pump. It wasn't there. My blood turned to ice. Before I could process what was happening, the car jolted violently. The entire vehicle seemed to rise a few inches off the ground, as though something massive had grabbed hold of it. I slammed the brakes, but the car wouldn't stop moving, something was pulling me backward. I looked over my shoulder, my breath catching in my throat. There, just beyond the rear windshield, was the figure. Its arms were outstretched, and its long, gnarled fingers were wrapped around the back of the car, digging into the metal as if it were paper. The headlights illuminated its grotesque form, casting long shadows that made it look even more distorted, even more monstrous. Its hollow eyes burned into me, and its mouth stretched wider, impossibly wide, until the darkness of the night seemed to pour out of it. The car shook violently as the figure began pulling it toward the edge of the road. My heart pounded in my ears, and I jammed my foot down on the gas pedal, desperate to break free from its grip. The engine roared in protest, but the car barely moved. The figure was too strong, too relentless. I screamed, my mind clouded with panic. The only thing I could think of was escape, anything to get away from this nightmare. With shaking hands, I reached for the gear shift, throwing it into drive and slamming on the gas again. The car jerked forward, and for a brief moment, I thought I might break free. But the figure didn't let go. Instead, it leaned in closer, its face pressing against the rear windshield. The glass fogged up from the cold breath it exhaled, and I could hear the faintest sound, like a whisper, or maybe a growl. The fingers dug deeper into the car, and I felt the metal bending under the pressure, warping as the figure's grip tightened. The car began to tip backward, the front wheels lifting off the ground as the thing dragged me toward the edge of the forest that lined the road. My vision blurred as the world tilted, the trees stretching up like black spires against the night sky. And then, the car fell. The ground dropped away beneath me, and everything became weightless. My stomach lurched as the vehicle careened down a steep embankment, branches and rocks scraping against the sides as it tumbled into the forest below. The sound of shattering glass and twisting metal filled my ears, and I braced myself, hands gripping the steering wheel in a futile attempt to stay in control. The world spun violently, and for a moment, I lost all sense of direction. Up became down became up, and the car continued its wild descent into the dark. Then, with a deafening crash, it stopped. I was thrown forward, my head slamming into the steering wheel. Pain exploded in my skull, and the world flickered in and out of focus. For a few seconds, I sat there, dazed, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. Silence. Except for the distant ringing in my ears, everything was still. The car had come to rest against a large tree, the front end crumpled like an accordion. Shattered glass glittered on the dashboard, and blood trickled from a gash on my forehead, warm and sticky. I blinked slowly, trying to shake off the dizziness that clouded my vision. I was alive. Somehow, I had survived. But then I heard it. The scraping sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the ringing in my ears. But it grew louder, more distinct, as if it were coming from just beyond the broken windshield. I felt the blood drain from my face, my heart racing with renewed terror. I turned my head slowly, my eyes locking onto the source of the sound. The figure stood at the top of the embankment, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. Its form was twisted and unnatural, its elongated limbs seeming to stretch even further as it peered down at me with those hollow, empty eyes. The shovel dragged behind it, scraping across the dirt, leaving a trail of rust and decay in its wake. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, it started walking. Down the slope. Toward me. Panic surged through my veins, and I struggled to free myself from the seatbelt, my fingers slipping on the buckle as adrenaline made my hands shake. I pulled, twisted, yanked, until finally, the belt snapped free. I crawled out of the wreckage, glass cutting into my palms as I stumbled to my feet. The figure was getting closer. I didn't have time to think. I turned and ran into the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps as branches whipped at my face and legs. The underbrush was thick, and every step felt like a battle, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Behind me, the scraping continued, relentless. It followed me, echoing through the trees, growing louder with every passing second. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't outrun it. And then, just as the darkness seemed to close in completely, I saw something through the trees, a light. #### Part 5, The Final Stand. The light flickered through the trees like a beacon of hope, casting long, wavering shadows on the forest floor. My legs burned, every muscle screaming in protest, but I pushed myself harder, tearing through the underbrush with wild desperation. The scraping noise echoed behind me, steady and unwavering, like a countdown to something inevitable. I burst through a thick line of trees and found myself stumbling into a clearing. There, in the middle of the darkness, stood a small, dilapidated cabin. The light came from inside, a dim, sickly glow that seeped through the cracks in the rotting wood. It wasn't a welcoming sight, but it was shelter. A brief moment of reprieve. Anything to put distance between me and the thing that was following. Without thinking, I sprinted toward the door. My shoes crunched against the gravel, the scraping growing louder behind me, so close it felt like the blade of the shovel was brushing against the back of my neck. I reached the door, throwing myself against it, and with a sharp crack, it swung open. I stumbled inside and slammed it shut behind me, throwing the rusted bolt across the lock. My heart pounded so violently in my chest I thought it might explode. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my eyes locked on the thin cracks in the wood where faint tendrils of moonlight crept through. I waited. For a moment, there was only silence. The scraping had stopped. My body trembled, muscles still locked in fight-or-flight mode, but I forced myself to breathe, to listen. The stillness was eerie, like the forest itself was holding its breath. No wind. No sounds of night animals. Nothing but the oppressive silence and the dim, flickering light that bathed the inside of the cabin in a sickly, yellow glow. I turned to survey the room, and that's when I saw it, the source of the light. It wasn't a lamp or a lantern. It was an old television, the same kind of ancient CRT model I'd seen back at the gas station. It sat on a crooked wooden table, glowing with static. The same faint hum filled the air, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. This place, it wasn't safe. I backed away from the television, my eyes darting around the room. There was hardly any furniture, just a few broken chairs and a filthy mattress shoved into one corner. The walls were lined with shelves, all of them empty except for layers of dust and cobwebs. But what caught my eye were the windows, shuttered from the inside, just like the ones in my house. A loud thud sounded from the door. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. The sound was unmistakable, something had hit the door. The scraping started again, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. I stood frozen in place, my back pressed against the far wall, as the noise continued. It was dragging something across the wooden porch. And then the door handle started to turn. My pulse quickened, and I frantically searched the room for something, anything, I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on an old rusted fire poker lying next to the stove. I scrambled toward it, grabbing the cold metal in my trembling hands, the weight of it oddly comforting despite the fear coursing through me. The door creaked. I gripped the fire poker tightly, my knuckles turning white, as the door slowly swung open. For a brief second, nothing happened. The clearing beyond the door was empty, bathed in the cold light of the moon. But then it stepped inside. The figure ducked under the doorframe, its skeletal form hunched and twisted, as if it had grown too tall for its own body. The shovel dragged behind it, leaving a trail of dirt and rust as it crossed the threshold. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt my knees buckle beneath me. It took one slow step forward, the air in the room growing colder with each passing moment. The smell of decay filled my lungs, making it hard to breathe, but I didn't move. I couldn't. It was like the figure's presence had rooted me to the spot. The creature paused, its head tilting slightly as it observed me, as if it were waiting for something. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it lifted the shovel and slammed it into the ground. The force of it sent a shockwave through the floor, the wooden boards splintering beneath the rusted blade. I flinched, the fire poker slipping from my grip, clattering to the floor with a deafening noise. That's when it smiled. The jagged tear that served as its mouth widened, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth that gleamed in the dim light. The sight of it filled me with a primal terror, the kind of fear that bypasses reason and sinks straight into your bones. It wasn't just a monster. It was something worse, something ancient, something that had been waiting in the shadows for far longer than I could comprehend. It took another step toward me, and I felt the cold hand of death closing around my throat. I had to act. With a scream, I lunged for the fire poker, swinging it wildly in front of me. The metal clanged against the creature's arm, but it barely flinched. The impact only seemed to amuse it, its grin widening as it stepped forward again, raising the shovel high above its head. I was out of options. Out of time. Desperation took over. My eyes darted to the flickering television screen, the static still hissing in the corner. It was the only thing in the room that seemed to have any power, any connection to whatever force had brought me here. I didn't know if it would work, but I had nothing left to lose. With the last of my strength, I grabbed the fire poker and swung it hard, straight into the television. The screen shattered with a brilliant flash of light, sparks flying in all directions. For a moment, the entire room was bathed in an intense glow, and the creature let out a bone-chilling scream, its hollow eyes widening in shock. The light enveloped everything, and for a split second, I felt weightless, suspended in the void between worlds. And then, darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the ground, my body bruised and aching. The cabin was gone. The figure was gone. I was back on the highway, my car parked on the side of the road. The engine was still running, the low hum of the motor the only sound in the night. The gas station was nowhere to be seen, and the road stretched out before me, empty and quiet. I sat up slowly, my head spinning. I wasn't sure what had just happened, whether it had been a nightmare, a hallucination, or something far worse. But the weight of it lingered, like a dark stain on my soul. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. The headlights pierced the darkness ahead, and I took a deep breath, forcing myself to drive. As I pulled back onto the road, the radio crackled to life. Static. And then, faintly, just beneath the noise, I heard the soft chime of the gas station's doorbell ringing one last time.